Jetzt haben wir den Bogen geschlagen zu Nicola Lindson. Hi, welcome, Nicola. I hope you're fine in Oxford. I would like to introduce you in German. I think you know your CV best, so I will tell the Germans a little bit about your area of research and what you have been done so far. Nicola Lindson ist die Mitherausgeberin und die Managerin eigentlich des Cochrane Tobacco Addiction, der Cochrane Tobacco Addiction Group. Cochrane sozusagen als übergreifende, unabhängige Gruppe, die Metastudien machen zu verschiedenen Problematiken und die sozusagen da weiter arbeiten und die übergreifenden Forschungsergebnisse eben allen Institutionen, allen Menschen zur Verfügung stellen. Cochrane Reviews sind sozusagen die höchste Qualität, der Olymp der Forschungsfragen und die Nicola Lindson hat eine neue Methode erfunden, nämlich eine Living Cochrane Systematic Review über elektronische Zigaretten und Rauchentwöhnung. Das heißt, dass nicht nur einmal ein Review gemacht wird, ein Gutachten, wo alle Daten zusammengebracht werden, eine Zusammenschau, sondern es ist ein fortlaufender Prozess. Nicola Lindson ist seit vielen Jahren aktiv im Kellogg College in Oxford und hat wesentliche Studien gemacht in England, zum Beispiel allmählich aufzuhören versus abrupt aufzuhören. Mit Ergebnis, es gab keine großen Unterschiede in den Erfolgsdaten. Ein Wechsel in der geistigen Verfassung nach dem in der psychischen Stabilität nach dem Aufhören mit dem Rauchen. Auch da hat es ein Systematic Review und eine Meta-Analyse gemacht und überhaupt die Bedeutung der E-Zigarette für die Rauchentwöhnung. Ich bin sehr froh, dass wir Sie heute dabei haben, weil sie kann uns aus erster Hand wirklich die neuesten Ergebnisse sagen. Und sie wird natürlich in Englisch sprechen und wir werden dann, wie eben auch schon bei Herrn Fagerström, das alles sehr gut managen, glaube ich, im Chat. So, long introduction, Nicola. I highlighted some of your studies and research work. I'm happy to have you here, extremely happy because you're very much involved in current reviews, meta-analysis, and especially in the Cochrane review. So please tell us a little bit about the role of e-cigs and other means for smoking cessation. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and hello everyone. I'll just share my slides with you. So today I'm going to speak to you a bit about a Cochrane review that I'm involved with and the most recent update of that, which was published in April 2021. So this work in particular is funded by Cancer Research UK and also the NIHR in the UK. And I'd just like to say that I have no conflicts of interest to declare. I'd also like to acknowledge our very large author team on the Cochrane review, in particular my colleague Jamie Hartman-Boyce, who is our lead author. We couldn't do it without her, but we also have a really large team of authors from all around the world who help us with this considerable project, which needs consistent updating each month. So thanks to them. I think I kind of caught that Heine was giving you a bit of a background of who Cochrane are, but I'll just quickly run through what we actually do. So Cochrane are a large global non-profit organisation, and what we aim to do is gather and combine all the best evidence from research to determine the benefits and risks of different healthcare interventions. So across the whole of Cochrane, that's across the board of health, but I particularly work with the Cochrane Tobacco Addiction Group, so you can guess the topic that we focus on. And so we do this by systematically reviewing the available evidence, and we have a very strong emphasis on quality assessment. So all of the studies that go into our review, we look at their quality to see how well we can trust them when we're bringing all that evidence together. And Cochrane methods are generally considered to be the gold standard worldwide, because over the years, members of Cochrane have developed a lot of the methodology around systematic reviews. So you'll find that even people who aren't particularly carrying out a Cochrane review will use Cochrane methodology to carry out their systematic reviews. And the idea of what we do is to help our stakeholders to basically improve their knowledge and make decisions around different healthcare interventions. So that ranges from healthcare providers, patients, carers, researchers, funders, policymakers, and guideline developers. So I'm hoping that what I'll have to say to you today will be useful to you. So as I say, this is in particular, I'll be talking today about our review of electronic cigarettes for smoking cessation, although we have lots of reviews in the area of tobacco control. So if you're interested, please feel free to check those out on the Cochrane Library. One thing that's also novel about Cochrane reviews is that they're updated regularly. So as more research becomes available, we update them so our conclusions stay up to date. So this review of electronic cigarettes for smoking cessation was first carried out in 2014. It was then updated in 2016. We then updated it again last year in October 2020. And then, as I say, it's been updated very recently and was published at the end of this April. And the objective of our review is to evaluate the safety and effect of using electronic cigarettes to help people who smoke to achieve long-term smoking abstinence. So in this case, we're looking specifically at people who already smoke and using electronic cigarettes as an aid to help them to stop. So in order to do that, we include two different types of study in our review. So first of all, we include randomized controlled trials. So that's looking at people who smoke randomized to either an electronic cigarette or a control intervention. Now, often with Cochrane reviews of interventions, we'd just leave it there and just look at randomized controlled trials, as they're generally considered to be the gold standard for primary research. However, because we need so much information in this field currently, but there's a lack of information. So, you know, it's still a relatively new area, and so we don't have lots of studies in this area. We've decided that at least for the time being, we're also including uncontrolled intervention studies. So they're studies in which all the people in the study were people who smoked, and they were all offered the same electronic cigarette intervention. And as I've already mentioned, what we're looking at is how many people those interventions help to quit smoking, and also any measures of harm in there. But I'll speak in a bit more detail about specifically what our outcomes are in a moment. So for this last update that was published in April, we searched 7 electronic databases, and they're searched up to February 2021. So the review is relatively up to date. We also contact researchers that we know are working in this area so that we can try and identify any studies that may not have been published yet that might be going on already. And also our searches of the databases include searches of trial registries and conference abstracts. So again, we can try and identify any ongoing studies, because as we know, not all studies end up being published, and we want to identify all the data that we possibly can so that we don't introduce any publication bias. So this review update, published in April 2021, includes 56 studies in over 12,000 participants. 6 of those studies were new between the update in October 2020 and this most recent update. 29 of our included studies are randomized controlled trials, so the rest of those studies are the uncontrolled intervention studies that I mentioned. And 23 of those randomized controlled trials contribute to our analyses looking at the number of people who managed to quit smoking. Just to give you a kind of brief overview of the studies, obviously with 56 studies, I can't go into them in a lot of detail, but I think one thing that's really interesting is looking at the different electronic cigarette device types that have been used across studies. So of our 56 included studies, 26 of those were looking at cartridge devices, so devices where people buy the cartridges and those are disposable. And they're the more kind of early stage devices, things like the cigalikes that actually looked like cigarettes, which aren't used so commonly anymore. And only one of those studies used the cartridge devices with high levels of nicotine delivery. 21 of our included studies look at refillable devices. Those are the kind of devices that people are refilling with e-liquid, so they, you don't have to keep throwing those away. And then 3 used both cartridge and refillable devices. But very interestingly, we now do have 1 study included in the review that is using pod devices. So they're devices that you refill with the nicotine salts, and they're the most recent devices. And then we have 5 studies that didn't report on the device type that was used. They just said that they used an electronic cigarette. As I've mentioned, with Cochrane, we have a high emphasis on looking at the quality of the studies that are included in our review. So we take this into account when we're making our conclusions. So of those 56 studies, we rated 5 of them at being at low risk of bias. We rated 10 as being at unclear risk of bias. So that generally means that there wasn't enough information for us to make a judgment of whether it was low or high risk. And then 41 were at high risk. And that sounds like a lot, but you need to bear in mind with that that includes those 25 non-randomized studies. Because they were non-randomized, they're automatically deemed to be at high risk. And then another important thing, of course, to consider with this type of study is the funding source. Of our 56 studies, 46 of those reported on the source of funding for the study, and 32 of those had no funding from the e-cigarette industry. So we can be somewhat reassured by that there is a lot of studies in our review that are independent of the industry. So I don't have time to go through all of the comparisons that we looked at in our review and all the outcomes. So I'm focusing on our primary comparisons and our primary outcomes today. And these are those that we have the most data for anyway. So for our other outcomes, it's more kind of single studies that are giving us the information. So this should give you the majority of the information from our review. So the first comparison that we are looking at is nicotine electronic cigarettes versus nicotine replacement therapy. And obviously nicotine replacement therapy is a recognized, highly used intervention for smoking cessation that we know is effective. So that's a really interesting comparison and probably the most relevant for us. Then we also look at nicotine electronic cigarettes versus non-nicotine electronic cigarettes. So that's sometimes what people call placebo e-cigarettes. And then finally, we look at nicotine e-cigarettes versus behavioural support or no support for smoking cessation. So as I said, I'll go into a little bit more detail about the outcomes that we looked at. So our primary outcomes are the ones here with the asterisks next to them. So for cessation, we look at whether people have managed to quit smoking at 6 months follow-up or more, and that's something that's common across all of the tobacco addiction group reviews. We use an intention to treat analysis, so if people are lost to follow-up, we assume that they are still smoking or have gone back to smoking, and we use the strictest definition of abstinence reported in a study. So if a study reports more than one definition of abstinence, we'll use, for example, continuous abstinence rather than point prevalence abstinence, or biochemically validated abstinence versus self-reported abstinence. And again, that's all standard to the tobacco addiction group. In terms of safety, for our primary outcomes, we're looking at adverse events or serious adverse events at 1 week or longer of e-cigarette use. So an adverse event is defined as any undesirable experience associated with the use of the electronic cigarette or whichever product is used in the control arm. And for serious adverse events, that's any adverse event where the patient outcome is either death, is life-threatening, results in hospitalization, disability, or birth defect, or it requires an intervention to prevent any of those outcomes. We also looked at changes in relevant biomarkers. As I say, I don't have a chance to go through that in today's presentation, but again, at that 1 week or longer follow-up, we are looking at things like levels of carcinogens and toxicants in the body, exhaled carbon monoxide, blood pressure, airway and lung function, and blood oxygen levels. But as I say, most of the studies that are looking at those outcomes at the moment, we've only got one study here or there looking at each of them. So we can't at the minute draw any strong conclusions from those. So you're not missing out on too much by the fact that I can't cover those today. So first off, looking at that first comparison I mentioned, nicotine e-cigarettes versus nicotine replacement therapy. Looking at quitting, what we found was that more people quit in the electronic cigarette group than in the NRT group. Something that we always do with Cochrane reviews is that we grade the certainty of the evidence. So we look at how certain we are in the evidence that we're getting out of our analyses. And we do this based on certain parameters that are pre-specified. So in this case, well, the highest level of certainty that we can have is high and the lowest is very low. In this case, we gave this evidence moderate certainty, so just one below the high certainty evidence. And that was because we downgraded it one level due to imprecision. So that basically that means that we don't have quite enough data yet to have high certainty in the evidence. But with moderate certainty evidence, I think we've got quite clear evidence here that it is e-cigarettes are increasing quit rates, but we're just not, that effect may move around slightly. For the same comparison, e-cigarettes versus NRT, now moving on to safety outcomes. For adverse events, we found no clear evidence that there was any difference in adverse events between the e-cigarette group and the NRT group. In this case, our certainty in the evidence was graded as low, and that's because in this case, we downgraded 2 levels due to imprecision. Again, just because of the amount of data that is in these analyses. And as you can see, in this analysis, for example, we only have 2 studies. So it's just that at the moment, we just don't have enough evidence to be completely confident in that effect. And as more evidence arises, that effect may change. And again, we're seeing the same for serious adverse events. So there was no evidence that serious adverse events differed between the groups. So you can see there's 2 studies contributing to this analysis, but actually one of the studies didn't register any serious adverse events. So it's really just a study by Hayek here that is giving us any data to base our conclusions on. And so again, as you'd imagine, this has been downgraded due to imprecision because of just there not being enough data, and that means our confidence intervals are very wide. So our next comparison, nicotine e-cigarette versus non-nicotine e-cigarette or placebo e-cigarette. Again, we found evidence that more people quit using the nicotine e-cigarette than the non-nicotine e-cigarette. Again, this evidence was graded as moderate certainty as for the quitting evidence in the last comparison. And again, that's just due to the fact that we just don't have lots of data at the minute for this comparison. And you can see that across both groups, we only had 82 people quitting, and that's basically what's limiting our confidence in the evidence there. So in terms of safety, for this comparison, again, no clear evidence that there was any difference in adverse events between the groups, and that was downgraded to just 1 level in this case due to the imprecision, again, small numbers of events, and the same again for serious adverse events. So no clear difference between the 2 groups, but we don't have that much data at present. As you can see, there are 4 studies included in that analysis, but only 1 is contributing to that effect estimate because 3 of the studies didn't actually report any serious adverse events, which is great for the participants, obviously, that were in that trial. But just because of the nature of our analysis, it means that then those studies cannot contribute to it. And it's just based on this 1 study by Eisenberg, where only 8 serious adverse events were reported across both study arms. So for our final comparison of nicotine e-cigarette versus behavioural support or no support, again, we found evidence that the number of people quitting was higher in the electronic cigarette arm. In this case, we downgraded our evidence a couple of levels more, so we got to very low certainty evidence. And that's again because we don't have that much data. As you can see, across both arms, only 41 people quit. But it's also in this case because we had to downgrade this evidence by 2 levels due to risk of bias. And the reason why we needed to do that was because all of the studies in this analysis were deemed to be at high risk of bias. And that's just because of the nature of this comparison and the way that we have to design studies to look at this comparison. Because some people in one group got an e-cigarette and people in the other group got behavioural support or no treatment, it was impossible to blind participants or the researchers to which group people were in across all of those trials. And that's why we have to rate each study as at high risk of bias. So it's just kind of manifests from the this particular type of comparison that the studies were all at high risk. And the same goes for the safety outcomes. So they also rated as low certainty. In this case, we found that in terms of adverse events, we did see more adverse events in the electronic cigarette arm than the behavioural support or no treatment arm. But I think that's kind of what we would expect with any kind of treatment, pharmacological, NRT, varenicline, for example. We see some adverse events, and we would expect to see more adverse events in a pharmacological arm or e-cigarette arm than we would in a behavioural support or no treatment arm. But these kind of adverse events are things like throat and mouth irritation, headache, nausea, and cough. So things like that, not serious adverse events. When we look at serious adverse events, we're again seeing that there's no clear evidence of a difference between those two groups, but again, also obviously limited by those small numbers of events that we're seeing. So just to kind of sum up and go over all the evidence in its entirety and the implications of practice that have come out of our review. The evidence across all of those comparisons I've just talked about suggests that nicotine e-cigarettes can aid in smoking cessation, and there's moderate certainty of that for that comparison with nicotine replacement therapy and placebo electronic cigarette. The evidence is very low certainty, obviously, compared with behavioural support, but if we look at the evidence in its entirety, we're seeing this clear, consistent message that people are quitting more with electronic cigarettes. And really, as I've said, the thing that we're most interested in is that nicotine replacement therapy comparison, because we know from many, many, many years of research that nicotine replacement therapy is a effective treatment for smoking cessation, and our review of nicotine replacement therapy has high certainty evidence of that. So if we're finding moderate certainty evidence that e-cigarettes are more effective than nicotine replacement therapy, then we can be pretty confident that e-cigarettes will be more effective than behavioural support or no support. And it's kind of the low numbers of events and the kind of inherent issues with those studies that meaning we can't rate the evidence more highly. So something I haven't been able to present in this presentation, but something that we are looking at as evidence arises is the effect of using nicotine e-cigarette in combination with other types of pharmacotherapy. There was a study of adding e-cigarettes to nicotine replacement therapy. However, the evidence around that is unclear, and the same is for varenicline. So there's one study comparing with varenicline, but again, it was very unclear. It's only a conference abstract, and there were some inconsistencies on how the outcomes were reported. So we need more evidence on that. It's obviously worth mentioning that none of the included studies detected serious adverse events considered potentially relevant to the e-cigarette use. So that's really encouraging. But it is also worth mentioning that our studies only went up to a 2-year follow-up. So we don't have any evidence that goes beyond 2-year follow-up of e-cigarette use. And obviously that's something that's really important when looking in this area to see if there are any long-term health effects. And as I've already mentioned, the most commonly reported adverse events were throat and mouth irritation, headache, cough, nausea, and these all tended to dissipate over time. So the kind of things we see with other therapies like NRT for smoking cessation. And as I mentioned, we looked at those biomarkers of health, and so some studies did look at this. As I say, they were usually singular studies looking at each one, so it's very hard to draw conclusions at this point. But what we didn't see was any cases where they were there was harm. There seemed to be harm caused through those biomarkers. And in some cases, we did see kind of encouraging findings about improvements in biomarkers when people switched from smoking to e-cigarette use. In terms of implications for research, obviously, through having looked at all this available research, we're kind of in a good place to be able to say what we would like to see in the future. And our conclusions are that we'd obviously like to see more studies looking at cessation at 6 months or longer, because by looking at cessation at 6 months, we have a better idea of whether people will stay quit in the long term. We know that people who get to 6 months of quitting are more likely to become lifelong smokers. We'd like to see more studies using active comparators. So as I've mentioned a couple of times now, we're really interested in, for example, that comparison with nicotine replacement therapy, as we know that there are already effective treatments for smoking cessation. So what we're really interested in is whether e-cigarettes are as good as or better than those already existing treatments. We'd like studies to assess the safety profile of electronic cigarettes for as long as possible, as I've already mentioned, because we really need to know about the long-term safety profile, and as yet we only have studies up to 2 years. And we'd like those studies to try and be powered to detect those differences in safety outcomes. As you would expect, a lot of these studies are looking at quitting smoking as well, and they're powered to detect the differences in smoking abstinence rates. And this is why there's really small level amounts of data in those analyses of safety outcomes. So what we need is bigger studies looking at those safety outcomes to help to increase our level of certainty in that safety evidence. We'd also like safety to be presented in both absolute and relative risk terms, because obviously we know that smoking is uniquely deadly, and what is really most useful is for us to be able to see how safe e-cigarettes are in comparison to smoking, because we know that e-cigarettes probably aren't going to be completely safe. But if they're safer than smoking, then obviously that is a very useful alternative for people who are smoking and might use e-cigarettes to help them to quit. And obviously, I spoke to you a bit at the beginning about these devices that are being used in the studies that we see. And what we're seeing is obviously there's a bit of a lag in studies using the most up-to-date devices. And that's understandable because research takes a long time to happen, from putting in a grant application for the years that it takes to carry out the study and then to get it published. So obviously we would urge people to use the most modern devices that they can at the times that they actually embark on their studies. And we're seeing that at the minute data on the pod type e-cigarettes are particularly lacking. As I mentioned, we do have one study in our review now, and hopefully we will see more in the future, but that will help us to draw more parallels with what is actually happening in the real world when e-cigarettes are being used. So finally, just to flag up that obviously a lot of these outcomes, we're saying we have limited certainty about them because there's not much data available. And so something that's really, really important is for us to be able to keep on top of the evidence that's coming out and updating our review to incorporate all that new evidence as it becomes available, and that will help us to increase our certainty. And so what we've done is we've converted this Cochrane review, and it's the first Cochrane review in the tobacco addiction group that we've done this with. We've converted it into a living review. And what that means is that we actually carry out our evidence searches monthly. When we find new studies that are eligible to be included in our review that's been completed, we publish links to that evidence every month. And if we find evidence that we think is going to change our conclusions of our review, or studies that look at new comparisons, for example, or new outcomes, then we start to embark on a new update of the review. So as I say, we'd published the review in October 2020. We were doing our monthly searches. We found some evidence that made us think, okay, this is going to change our conclusions. And we updated the review. It was published in April. And we've now also, even since our February searches, have found new evidence that we again think might change our conclusions. And so we're again updating the review, and we're expected another update of the review to be published later this year. And we're hoping that that's going to help our stakeholders to keep informed and up to date with the evidence available. So as part of this Living Systematic Review project, we've got a really big emphasis on trying to disseminate the findings and get everything out there, otherwise what's the point? So what we're doing is we're coming up with briefing documents each month. This first one is aimed at members of the public, and we also have one aimed at clinicians and policymakers. As well as this, myself and my colleague, Jamie Hartman-Boyce, who is our lead author, are doing monthly podcasts where we talk about the evidence that we found that month. And we're also conducting interviews with researchers in the field, focusing on different topics within the field of electronic cigarette research. And that's available on Spotify and iTunes. So basically, if you do want any more information on what I've just talked to you about, you can see the full review in the Cochrane library. There's more detail on everything I've presented, but also the secondary outcomes, those biomarkers, and some of the other comparisons we've looked at. And there's also the data from the uncontrolled studies there, because I've just been through the evidence from the RCTs here. And if you're interested in the Living Systematic Review project and those briefing documents and links to the podcast and also other presentations that we do, then you can go to the link that's at the bottom of that slide there, and I think the slides are going to be distributed after this talk, and you can go to that and see what we're getting up to every month. So thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. That's fine. Nicola? Okay, stop the, very good, thank you very much. And thanks for updating us. And it's a very charming construction, this Living Systematic Review, which indeed is bringing up people to the current stage of research at more or less every month, the latest from April 2021. That's very fine. And I was also very impressed by the other means of dissemination of your results by monthly podcasts from Jamie Hartman-Boyce, which we had in another webinar in Switzerland in February this year. And yeah, thanks to these very good comparison and overview of what we can expect from e-cigarettes with regards to quitting at 6 months plus. A question arises to that topic from the chat. The European Commission, the SCEAR report, or I don't know how you pronounce it, SCEAR report or SCEAR report?
Yeah, I'm not sure myself.
Okay. That comes with me. The SCEAR report contradicts or ignores Cochrane results, as it is the case in many committees on the ministerial level in Germany, by the way. We had a financial committee where the results from the Cochrane review have been called singular results, or results from with singular impact. Are you in contact with the Commission to correct this?
We haven't had any direct contact, I don't think. And it would be, this has been brought to our attention in a previous talk we did actually, and it would be good if we could reach out. We often are in contact with kind of guideline developers and various bodies like that who do get in touch with us to ask us to present or share the evidence, but we haven't had any contact from European Commission, but we probably should reach out, because it's just, as you can imagine, quite hard to keep abreast of everything that's going on around the world. But I think it's been brought to our attention a couple of times now, so something I think we should try and contact the people involved and see if they would be interested in.
So indeed, I would fully support that, because with the Cochrane review results, we have the highest methodological quality standard of results presentation and combining results that we have globally. And so the more it is astonishing that, let's say, central bodies talking about future strategies of stop smoking cessations are not informed, ignore, contradict, or neglect even these study results. So it's very astonishing. And another question from the chat. Please always define exactly the meaning of cessation and abstinence. Smoking, nicotine, behavior, vaping without nicotine. A major conflict in discussions is often a difference in what participants implicitly assume when they use these words.
Yes, I appreciate that. Yeah, so in the way we do it is that it is tobacco use. And in these studies, it was smoked tobacco. But I appreciate that now there is that kind of blurred line between whether people mean quitting vaping. I think we're very much obviously influenced by the UK stance on things, which is very much kind of harm reduction friendly, and that by quitting we mean quitting tobacco smoking, and people may be continuing to use NRT or maybe continuing to use electronic cigarettes, but we would still count that as cessation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Linda. And then thank you for an excellent presentation. Will Cochrane be doing any reviews on the assessment of relative risk between the harm caused by combustible cigarettes with non-combustible nicotine alternatives, such as e-cigarettes, oral nicotine pouches, and heated tobacco products?
Well, in some ways, that's what we are doing with this review. Unfortunately, because of the biomarkers being measured less frequently, it's harder for us to draw clear conclusions on that. But hopefully, as more studies become available, we'll be able to see that those relative harms between people continuing to smoke and people who manage to give up smoking. We're actually hoping at some point in the future to do a review of snus, but it's just not. At the minute, we include studies of snus in our harm reduction review, which looks at continued tobacco use. Mm-hmm. And so switching to snus in that review is classed as harm reduction. So that's why it's included in there. And I think there's only one study in there. I could be wrong, but at the minute it was last updated in 2016. But I think what we'd like to do is separate out switching to smokeless tobacco into a separate review. We're currently in the process, and I say we're, as a managing editor, but I'm not an author on this one. We've got a review in progress of heat not burn tobacco products, and that will not only look at RCTs, but it will also look at observational data about uptake. So looking at the population effects of these types of devices being made available as well, because obviously at the minute there's not many studies looking at heated tobacco as a cessation aid or smoked tobacco cessation aid.
Mm-hmm. And is dialogue possible when some participants are already committed to an e-cigarette free Germany by 2040? Can this be changed?
I hope so. Again, I guess it involves engagement, and that's what we're really trying to do, but we're always open to suggestions on how we can do it better. A big part of this living review project was that we wanted to try different ways of disseminating, and this is partly why we ended up doing the podcast, which we'd never done before and was quite a scary experience. But it's been a new way of engaging for us, and I think we've enjoyed it, and I think we have succeeded in engaging with people we wouldn't usually do. But we're also, so for example, in the UK, we're trying to engage more with parliamentarians, which is often a very tricky thing to do. So we very much would like to, you know, increase dialogue with these organisations across the world. It's just obviously difficult because we are a small team, and trying to do that proactively is difficult. So we always love it when, you know, people from different governments across the world get in touch with us, and because we're more than happy to engage.
Okay. And the last, more a comment than a question. I don't know whether you know the Perry Rhodan novels. It's sort of a science fiction, and the author of these science fiction novels was Carl Herbert Scher. And one of the participants says his novels had more relation to scientific facts than the report of the same called commission. Finally, we got it. Thank you very much, Nicola. It was a very impressive presentation, and we can use the results in many of our discussions. We will definitely come back to the podcasts, to the fact sheets, and to many other publications you did in the last years in order to work with them in our argumentation. Are we allowed to put your presentation on our website, to this, to the university website, to this, attached to this webinar?
Yes, that's fine. I'll send it through to you.
That would be great. And so far, because something went rather quickly, so some of us definitely would like to have another perspective to these, to your data and to the research. Many thanks, Nicola.
No
have
problem.
a good day
Thank you.
in Oxford.
You too.
And bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.